If you think having a bad Wi-Fi connection or a long line at the grocery store constitutes a rough day, you are about to get a massive reality check. Imagine waking up in a world where the sun literally doesn't shine for 18 months, or where a microscopic hitchhiker on a flea wipes out half of everyone you've ever met. History is often sold to us as a steady climb toward progress, but the truth is much filtered. It is a series of peaks and terrifying valleys where the survival of the human species was less of a guarantee and more of a miracle. Today, we are stripping away the romanticism of the past to look at the moments when being alive was a genuine hazard. We are counting down the most dangerous times to be a human being, from the volcanic winters of the ancient world to the industrial nightmares of the modern era. Let's start with what scientists and historians often call the worst year in human history, 536 Common Era. If you lived in Europe, the Middle East, or parts of Asia during this time, you woke up to a mystery that felt like the end of the world. A mysterious blue-gray fog rolled across the sky and simply stayed there. It blocked out the sun so effectively that the light at noon looked like the twilight of dusk. This wasn't just a spooky atmosphere. It was a global catastrophe. Temperatures plummeted, leading to the coldest decade in over 2,000 years. This fog was likely caused by a massive volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland or Central America, which spewed so much ash into the atmosphere that it created a literal shroud over the planet. Without sunlight, crops failed from Ireland to China. Imagine a summer where snow fell in August. In China, records speak of a yellow dust that rained down like snow. Famine became the norm, and as bodies grew weak from hunger, foundations were laid for something even worse. Shortly after the sun disappeared, the bubonic plague made its first major appearance in the Byzantine Empire. This combination of a frozen world, starving populations, and a new, terrifying illness made the mid-6th century a period where survival was a game of extreme chance. You weren't just fighting an enemy army, you were fighting the planet itself. If we slide forward a few centuries, we arrive at the mid-14th century, specifically the years between 1347 and 1351. This is the era of the Black Plague. While we've all heard the name, it is hard to wrap our modern minds around the sheer speed of the devastation. Most historical disasters are localized, but this was a continental collapse. It arrived on merchant ships in Sicily and spread like wildfire. Within weeks, entire villages were silenced. There was no medical understanding of what was happening. People blamed the alignment of the stars, bad air, or divine punishment. The social fabric didn't just tear, it disintegrated. When the illness entered a home, families often fled, leaving their loved ones behind because the fear of the invisible enemy was greater than the bond of blood. Law and order vanished in many cities because the authorities were just as vulnerable as the commoners. The sheer volume of loss changed the value of human labor forever. Before the plague, peasants were a dime a dozen. Afterward, there were so few people left to work the land that the survivors could demand higher wages and more rights, effectively ending the feudal system in Europe. But the price for that social progress was paid in hundreds of millions of lives. If you lived through the year 1348, you were walking through a landscape of ghost towns and silence. But danger isn't always about illness or climate. Sometimes, the danger comes from the sheer scale of human ambition and the collision of worlds. Let's talk about the year 1241 in Central Europe. To a villager in Hungary or Poland, the arrival of the Mongol Empire felt like an encounter with an alien civilization. The Mongols were the most effective military machine the world had ever seen. They moved with a speed that defied logic, covering distances that European armies thought impossible. In 1241, the Mongols launched a coordinated invasion that shattered the knights of Europe. At the Battle of Mohi, the Hungarian army was virtually wiped out in a single morning. The terrified survivors ran into the woods, but there was nowhere to hide. The Mongols weren't just conquering territory. They were dismantling the existing order. They used psychological warfare, lighting extra campfires to make their numbers look larger, and using smoke screens to confuse their enemies. If you were in the path of the Great Khan's generals in the mid-13th century, the chances of your community surviving intact were almost zero. It was a period where the traditional rules of warfare were rewritten in dust and fire, and the safety of a castle wall suddenly meant nothing against the tactical genius of the steppe. Now, let's pivot to a time that often gets overlooked because it happened so long ago that it feels like a myth, even though the evidence is etched in our DNA. About 74,000 years ago, the human race came incredibly close to vanishing entirely. This is the Toba supereruption, located in present-day Sumatra. Mount Toba exploded with a force so massive it beggars belief. It was thousands of times more powerful than any volcanic event in recorded human history. The explosion sent enough ash and sulfur into the stratosphere to create a volcanic winter that lasted for years, possibly a decade. Global temperatures dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius. For the small populations of early humans scattered across Africa and Asia, this was a catastrophe beyond measure. The plants they gathered died, and the animals they hunted migrated or perished. Some geneticists point to a bottleneck in human history around this time, suggesting that the entire global population of humans may have dropped to just a few thousand individuals. Imagine that. Every single person on Earth today might be a descendant of that tiny group of survivors who managed to find a way through the freezing darkness. It is perhaps the most dangerous moment in the history of our species, where a single natural event nearly ended the human experiment before it truly began. Moving into more modern times, we have to look at the year 1918. The world was already exhausted by 4 years of industrial-scale conflict in the First World War. Millions of men were living in cramped, damp, and unsanitary trenches, and then the Spanish flu arrived. Despite the name, it didn't start in Spain. It just got that name because Spain was neutral in the war and was the only country accurately reporting the numbers. This flu was unique because unlike most seasonal illnesses that affect the very young and the very old, this strain targeted the healthy and the strong. It turned the body's own immune system against itself. Because of the war, millions of people were moving across the globe on ships and trains, acting as the perfect delivery system for the virus. In many cities, the sirens were constant. Schools and theaters were turned into emergency wards. There weren't enough workers to bury the fallen, so the tasks were left to the families. Just as the world thought it was seeing the light at the end of the tunnel with the end of the war, a new and even more efficient predator emerged. It is estimated that more people fell to this illness in 15 months than were lost in the entire 4 years of the Great War. It was a time when a simple cough from a stranger felt like a sentence of doom. Let's go back to high antiquity for a moment and look at the Bronze Age collapse around 1177 before the Common Era. Before this time, the Eastern Mediterranean was a thriving, interconnected web of powerful civilizations. You had the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaean Greeks, and the Babylonians. They traded gold, tin, and ivory. They had complex bureaucracies and massive monuments. And then, within a few decades, it all came crashing down. Civilizations that had lasted for centuries simply vanished. Cities were burned and never rebuilt. Writing systems were lost. This wasn't just caused by one thing. It was a perfect storm. Drought led to famine, which led to internal uprisings. Foreign invaders, known to history as the Sea People, attacked the coasts. The trade routes that these empires relied on were cut off. If you were an aristocrat in a Greek palace or a farmer in the Levant during this period, you watched the entire world fall apart in real time. It was the original apocalypse. The sophisticated, globalized world of the Bronze Age was replaced by a dark age that lasted for centuries. It is a terrifying reminder that no matter how advanced a society feels, it is always just a few missed harvests or a few broken trade deals away from total collapse. If we look at the 17th century, we find the 30 Years' War, which turned Central Europe into a graveyard between 1618 and 1648. This wasn't just a political conflict. It was a religious and social meltdown. Armies that were little more than organized groups of mercenaries moved across the landscape, living off the land. This is a polite way of saying they took everything from the people living there. The danger of this era wasn't just the fighting, it was the sheer lawlessness. Soldiers brought typhus and plague with them as they moved. In some parts of modern-day Germany, the population dropped by over 50%. Farms were abandoned, and wolves returned to regions where they hadn't been seen in generations. It was a time of such profound misery that many people believed they were living through the literal end of days. The survivors were left in a world that had been physically and spiritually hollowed out. It stands as one of the most brutal and prolonged periods of human-on-human violence in history, where the civilian population bore the brunt of the chaos. But what about the danger of the invisible? The 16th century was arguably the most dangerous time to be alive in the Americas. When the Spanish arrived in the New World, they didn't just bring steel and horses. They brought a biological arsenal for which the local populations had no defense. Smallpox, measles, and the flu tore through the Aztec and Inca empires with a speed that outperformed any army. In many cases, the illnesses traveled faster than the explorers themselves. A messenger would arrive from a neighboring village with news of a strange sickness, and a week later, his own people would be falling. Some estimates suggest that 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas was lost within a century of contact. This wasn't just a military conquest, it was a biological erasure. The complex societies of the Americas, with their massive cities and advanced agriculture, were decimated before they even fully understood who these newcomers were. If you were a member of a Mesoamerican civilization in the 1520s, you were living through the swiftest and most total population collapse in human history. Now let's talk about a danger that comes from the ground itself. The mid-19th century in China was the setting for the Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from 1850 to 1864. This is often cited as the bloodiest civil war in human history. It was started by a man named Hong Xiuquan, who believed he was the younger brother of a religious figure and was destined to overthrow the Qing dynasty. What followed was a conflict of unimaginable scale. Tens of millions of people were lost, not just in the battles, but in the famines and the scorched earth tactics used by both sides. Entire provinces were stripped of their resources. The scale of the loss is so vast that it's almost impossible to comprehend. While the American Civil War was happening at the same time and is often the focus of Western history, the Taiping Rebellion was happening on a scale 10 times larger. It was a time when a massive portion of the world's population was caught in a cycle of ideological fervor and industrial-scale suffering. But we cannot talk about the most dangerous times to be alive without mentioning the Maoist era in China, specifically the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s. This was a man-made disaster of unprecedented proportions. In an attempt to rapidly transform the country from an agrarian economy to an industrial superpower, the government ordered farmers to stop growing food and start making steel in backyard furnaces. The result was a total collapse of the food supply. For 4 years, a massive portion of the population lived in a state of constant starvation. People were reduced to eating tree bark, grass, and leather. Between 15 and 45 million people are estimated to have perished in just a few years. This wasn't caused by a volcano or a virus. It was caused by a policy error and the refusal to admit that the plan was failing. It is a grim testament to the fact that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't always a predator or a storm. Sometimes, it is a government with absolute power and a flawed idea. In the 20th century, we also had the period of the Holocaust and the Second World War. From 1939 to 1945, the entire planet was turned into a factory for destruction. While we focus on the soldiers, the civilian experience was one of constant, grinding terror. If you were in a city in Europe or Japan, the sky itself became a source of danger as long-range bombers could rain down fire at any time. If you belonged to a group targeted by the regime, the danger was systematic and inescapable. The industrialization of the loss of life reached its zenith during this time. Scientific progress, which had been celebrated for a century, was now being used to design more efficient ways to end human life. It was a period that forced humanity to look into a mirror and see the heights of its own cruelty. But let's consider a different kind of danger, one that was more a psychological threat, the height of the Cold War. Specifically, the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. This was the closest we have ever come to a total, global conclusion of history. For those 13 days, the leaders of the US and the Soviet Union were locked in a game of nuclear chicken. If you were alive then, especially in a major city, there was a very real possibility that you went to bed one night and wouldn't wake up the next morning, but that the entire city would be gone. The fear wasn't about a plague you could see or an army you could fight. It was about a push-button end to everything. The danger was total, global, and completely out of the hands of the ordinary person. It was a moment of absolute vulnerability for the entire human race, where the survival of the planet depended on the temperament of 2 men and the reliability of a few communication lines. To find the true root of why these times were so dangerous, we have to understand the fragility of our systems. When the Roman Empire fell in the West during the 5th century, it wasn't just about the Goths or the Huns. It was the collapse of the logistics that kept people fed. The Roman peace had allowed for a massive population growth because grain could be moved from Egypt to Rome, and wine could be moved from Gaul to Britain. When the trade routes were cut, the urban populations simply disappeared. They fled to the countryside or perished. The standard of living dropped so sharply that it took over 1,000 years to get back to the level of plumbing and infrastructure the Romans had. Living through the 5th century, meant watching the lights of civilization go out one by one, replaced by a much harsher, more localized struggle for existence. The common thread in all these dangerous times is the sudden loss of predictability. Humans are incredibly good at adapting to harsh conditions as long as those conditions are predictable. We can handle a cold winter if we know it's coming. We can handle a war if we know where the front lines are. But in 536, the sun didn't come back. In 1348, the enemy was invisible. In 1241, the invaders moved faster than news. When the rules of the world are suddenly rewritten, that is when the danger becomes absolute. We often think of ourselves as safe because we have antibiotics, GPS, and a global food supply. But many of these historical disasters show that our strengths are also our vulnerabilities. Our globalized food supply is efficient, but it's also fragile. Our interconnected world allows for the spread of ideas, but it also allows for the spread of pathogens. By studying these dangerous eras, we aren't just looking at the past, we are looking at the stress tests of the human species. Think about the sheer grit of the survivors of the Toba eruption. They had no technology, no medicine, and no understanding of what was happening to their world. Yet they found a way. Think about the people in 1918 who kept going while the world was falling apart from war and flu. These stories are a testament to the fact that while history is dangerous, it is also a story of incredible resilience. We are the children of the survivors of every single one of these catastrophes. We have the DNA of people who survived the Black Plague, the Mongol invasions, the volcanic winters, and the total wars. As we look across the horizon of time, it is clear that danger is a constant companion to the human story. There will always be moments where the ground shifts or the air turns cold. But by remembering the times when the world was at its most hazardous, we gain a deeper appreciation for the stability we often take for granted. We learn that civilization is a thin veneer that requires constant maintenance and a certain level of cooperation. From the frozen fields of the mid-6th century to the tense rooms of the 1960s, history is a reminder that we are part of a long chain of endurance. Danger is terrifying, but it is also the forge in which our species was shaped. Every period we've discussed brought about a massive shift in how humans interact with each other and their environment. The plague led to the rise of the middle class. The Bronze Age collapse led to the Iron Age and the rise of the classical world. Even the worst times carry the seeds of what comes next. So, the next time you feel like the world is spinning out of control, remember the blue fog of 536 or the silent villages of 1348. We have been here before, and we have always found a way through. The most dangerous times to be alive were not just periods of loss. They were periods of profound transformation. They are the moments that truly defined who we are and what we are capable of surviving. History is a wild ride, and while it isn't always safe, it is never boring. Knowing where we've been and what we've faced is the only way to navigate the dangers that haven't even arrived yet. Thank you for walking through these shadows with me today. Nature and history have thrown everything they have at us, and yet here we are, still telling the story.